The restaurant was one of those places where the silverware gleamed a little too brightly and the prices weren't listed on the menu, the kind of establishment where appearances mattered more than authenticity. Sarah pressed her palms against the white tablecloth, feeling the expensive fabric beneath her fingertips, and wondered how her life had brought her to this precise moment of humiliation. Across from her sat Marcus Chen, a man she'd met exactly twice before, whose kind eyes and gentle smile had made her believe, just for a moment, that the universe might finally be on her side. But now, as the waiter placed the check discreetly beside Marcus's water glass, Sarah felt the familiar weight of poverty crushing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to exist in a world that seemed designed for everyone but her. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. The dinner invitation had come during a chance encounter at the community center where Sarah volunteered on weekends, teaching basic computer skills to elderly residents. Marcus had been there visiting his grandmother, and their conversation had flowed so naturally that when he suggested dinner, she'd said yes before her practical mind could intervene with its usual chorus of warnings and worst-case scenarios. Sarah had worn her only decent dress, a navy blue number she'd found at Goodwill 3 years ago, the hem carefully mended where it had begun to fray. She'd walked the 42 blocks to the restaurant because the bus fare was $2.75 each way, and that $5.50 represented 2 meals, maybe 3 if she was careful. Her feet ached in shoes that were half a size too small, but she'd smiled through the pain, determined to enjoy one evening where she could pretend to be someone else. Someone whose checking account didn't hover perpetually in the single digits. Someone who didn't count pennies at the grocery store or donate plasma twice a week to make rent. The meal had been beautiful. Marcus had ordered confidently, asking her preferences, making her laugh with stories about his work as a civil engineer and his ongoing battle to convince his grandmother to stop trying to set him up with every single woman in her church. Sarah had relaxed, almost forgetting the calculator constantly running in the back of her mind. She'd ordered the least expensive entree she could find, a pasta dish that still cost more than she typically spent on food in an entire week. But now, watching Marcus reach for his wallet, reality came flooding back with the force of a tidal wave. "This was really wonderful," Marcus said, his voice warm. "I'm so glad we did this." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She should say something. "Thank you. Yes, it was lovely. Let's do it again." But the words stuck somewhere between her brain and her mouth, tangled up with shame and math, the brutal arithmetic of poverty that never stopped calculating. Marcus signed the check with a flourish, then looked at her with those impossibly kind eyes. "Can I give you a ride home? My car's just around the corner." This was it. The moment where she should gracefully accept, maintaining whatever dignity she had left. Instead, Sarah heard herself saying, "Actually, I walked here. I live pretty far, and I." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, propelled by exhaustion and 3 weeks of sleeping poorly because her apartment's heater was broken and she couldn't afford to fix it. "I can't even afford the bus ride home." The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Sarah watched Marcus's expression shift. Surprise, confusion, and then something that made her chest ache even more, understanding without pity. "How far do we have to go?" he asked. Simply. "We." The word came out as barely a whisper. "To get you home safely." "How far?" Sarah told him. 7 miles. Across the city to a neighborhood where people didn't eat at restaurants with unmarked prices. Marcus just nodded, stood up, and offered her his arm as naturally as if she'd told him she lived next door. They walked to his car in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When he opened the passenger door for her, Sarah noticed his vehicle wasn't the luxury model she might have expected. It was a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the rear bumper and a child's car seat in the back. Not his child, he explained as they pulled onto the road, his sister's son, whom he picked up from daycare twice a week to help her out. As they drove through the city, something shifted. Maybe it was the darkness outside, making the car feel like a small, safe bubble in an uncertain world. Maybe it was the fact that her most humiliating truth was already out there, so what else did she have to lose? Whatever the reason, Sarah began to talk. She told him about losing her job 6 months ago when the bookstore she'd managed for 8 years closed down. About the unemployment benefits that barely covered rent. About applying to 73 positions and getting rejection after rejection, or worse, silence. She told him about her mother's medical bills from the cancer treatment 2 years ago, that she'd taken on willingly but that now felt like an anchor dragging her under. About the college degree she'd been so proud of, now seemingly worthless in a job market that wanted experience she didn't have for positions that didn't pay enough to live on anyway. Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes on the road, one hand on the steering wheel. When she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I grew up in a trailer park in rural Oregon. My dad left when I was 6. My mom worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. I got into college on scholarships and still graduated with $80,000 in student debt. I remember eating ramen for dinner and calling it a feast. I remember choosing between gas money and groceries. I remember the shame of it, that specific kind of shame that comes from not having enough in a world that equates worth with wealth." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him. His profile in the dashboard light showed someone who understood, who had walked the path she was walking now. "What changed?" she asked. "Luck, mostly. Being in the right place at the right time. A professor who went to bat for me. A company willing to take a chance on someone hungry to prove themselves. And people who helped when I needed it most, even in small ways. Especially in small ways." He glanced at her. "The bus fare kind of ways." They pulled up outside her apartment building, a worn-down complex where the exterior lights had been broken for months. Sarah expected to feel embarrassed, but instead she felt something close to relief. Marcus reached into his wallet, and Sarah's stomach tightened, ready to refuse charity. But he didn't pull out money. Instead, he handed her a business card. Not his, someone else's. "This is my friend Jennifer. She runs for a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. They're hiring, and I know for a fact they value people with management experience. Would it be okay if I sent her your resume?" Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus smiled, but it was tinged with something bittersweet. "Because 10 years ago, someone did it for me. A stranger who didn't have to care, but did. And because that pasta you ordered. I saw you scanning the menu for the cheapest thing. I saw you push away the bread basket after one piece even though you were hungry. I saw you check your phone nervously like you were calculating something painful." He paused. "I saw you, Sarah. Really saw you. And what I saw was someone fighting like hell to stay afloat with grace and dignity. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's everything to be admired." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. "Thank you," she whispered. "For dinner. For the ride. For seeing me. Send me your resume tonight if you can. Tomorrow morning at the latest." 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the lobby of that marketing firm, wearing a new interview suit she'd bought with her first paycheck. The job wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a real start. Her email to Jennifer had turned into a phone screen, then an in-person interview, then an offer that came with health insurance and a salary that meant she could finally breathe again. But more than the job, what stayed with her was the lesson Marcus had taught her that night in his old Honda, that humanity isn't measured in grand gestures or sweeping changes. Sometimes it's measured in bus fare, in business cards, in someone saying, "I see you," when you feel invisible. Sometimes kindness is simply bearing witness to someone else's struggle and offering what you can, even when what you can offer feels impossibly small. Sarah never forgot that she couldn't afford the bus ride home. But she also never forgot the man who saw past her shame to her strength, and in doing so, reminded her that poverty might define her circumstances, but it would never define her worth. That was the real gift, not the job, not the paycheck, but the reminder that in a world that often feels cold and transactional, there are still people who lead with compassion. People who understand that we're all one bad break away from needing help, and one good human away from finding hope again.